gentlemen, thank you for coming. I thank the forum for giving me respite for the hardships of my professional life back home. And I'm most grateful for the support I have been receiving from the forum through the fellowship that has brought me here. And my special thanks to its staff, Sally, Xerxes, Melissa, JJ, Jeff, and Jessica for being so welcoming here. And thanks to Peter Lewis for sharing his expertise on this panel with me. I'm here today to talk about corruption. And there are three sets of constitutional and legal measures that inform my presentation, which in my view represent the closing of the space for democratization in the country. These measures are the 2010 Constitution, which further concentrates the powers in the office of the President, overriding the basic constitutional principle of separation of powers. And the two legal initiatives that have been submitted to Parliament last April aim at cracking down on free speech and alternative media on the net, while the other is part of the strategy to prevent the establishment of a vibrant and autonomous private sector in the country. This legal pyramid provides the sum total of both the current state of democratization in the country and its political economy. And they are critical to address what I see as the major problem in the country, as recognized by both the authorities and the society at large, the issue of corruption as the defining issue in the country. With the monopoly of the state in the hands of the president, as I will explain, if there is any space to peacefully countervail the regime's power and abuses, it is thought to be on civil society, on the space for freedom of expression, or in the market. And this is because the political parties are so weak and civil society is so weak and extremely dependent on either government funding or international funding in the case of the NGOs, that basically makes it extremely difficult for them to operate. So I point that these legal initiatives are the last frontiers for independent voices and for business opportunities for individuals autonomous of the state. And these legal initiatives seek to curtail the free flow of ideas and for the selective discrimination of private investors in a move to foreclose the eventual challenges that these spaces might pose to the status quo of the regime. I'll just give a very brief overview of this. Is basically what the Constitution establishes in terms of the sovereignty. And this Constitution was passed last year. The ruling MPLA, the movement for the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, has over 81% of the seats in parliament. So it is a constitution that was not forced upon the country by international pressure or by the pressure of the opposition. It is the free will of the ruling party to approve this constitution that on one hand grants more fundamental rights to citizens, but has no limitations of powers, no separation of powers that might enable for a better protection of the citizens. For instance, one of the major changes in the constitutional reform is that the parliament no longer has the power to call the government to account. In the previous constitutional law, parliament could call the government to explain its actions, and it could also set motions of censure, the term? Yes, to the government, and it can no longer do that. And also people have lost the constitutional right to elect the president. In 92, so we have a situation whereby the president remains unelected because in 92, the second round, when we had the first multi-party elections in 92, the second round between Mr. Dos Santos and the late rebel leader Jonas Savimbi never took place. In 2009, we were scheduled to have elections, presidential elections, 1 year after the second legislative elections in the country. And these elections never took place. And one of the arguments was that it was too expensive to do it. And the new constitution now takes that away. And President Dos Santos has been in power for 32 years. He is currently the third longest serving African ruler after Gaddafi and Obiang of Equatorial Guinea. But the Angolan constitution must be read in conjunction with the statutes of the ruling party. And by reading those in conjunction, one can see that the president has full powers to remain in power until 2022 and to avert any rebellion in parliament. So even within the party, members of the party have no ways of addressing certain issues because of the way the president runs the party on a daily basis as the president of the party as well. And this also enables the government to avert any internal power struggles for his replacement and choose his own successor when the time comes for him to do so. But what's also kind of important to analyze here is that in the previous constitution, members of the government had a right to vote in the Council of Ministers. It was never exercised, but that right was there in the Constitution. And currently, as all the powers, the government was abolished as a sovereign body of the state, and the powers transferred to the presidency, the members of the Council of Ministers lost that writing to vote on certain issues. The decision is solely rests on the president, and that's why it is critical first to look at the presidential powers in order to address the issue of corruption in the country. And before that, how did this configuration was established? From 1975, when the country became independent, to 2002, when the war ended, one of the main arguments used for the consolidation of the presidential powers was the necessity to centralize the war effort, to have one tight command and hierarchy in the decision-making process. And from 1980 to 92, the president also served as the speaker of the People's Assembly. So there was no separation between the parliament and the presidency. And we've just returned to that very same period because the president is elected, if one can call it election, on the list submitted for the legislative elections. The first name on the list of the winning party becomes the president. And that means, as some constitutionalists have argued, that makes the president the effective leader of parliament. And since 2002, the argument that has been used for this consolidation of powers is to do with the necessity for political stability and the lack of opposition, as I have explained before, due to the control of the executive on the political parties, because for the political parties to operate, they need funds from the state by law. And because of the small numbers of the opposition parties have in parliament 29 seats out of 220, and the funding they receive is proportional. It does not enable them to be able to compete with the ruling party in equal terms. one of the aspects of this concentration of the presidential powers and coming on to the issue of corruption has to do with the control of the judiciary or the judicial. We have still in place one Marxist-Leninist law, even though we have this new constitution, in which the president gives direct instructions to the attorney general, which must be complied with. It means that basically no case against the government or public officials can be investigated without the president's approval. And the president can terminate any case at any time because his instructions are defined as law. And you will see now why this is critical in the process of dealing against corruption. In 2009, the president declared a zero tolerance policy against corruption. And the president also complained to the public that he did not have enough evidence to prosecute cases against corruption for him to take action. As a journalist who's been investigating corruption, I decided to send a memorandum to the president informing him of the activities of the Attorney General, who is directly controlled by him. And the Attorney General in 2009 was serving as a majority shareholder and managing director of a number of companies against the law. And these companies, some of them were providing services to the Office of the Attorney General, again against the law, conflating public and private interests, and to other public institutions. The president took no action. And that case was public, the letter was circulated. So all the public exposures that take place on cases of corruption do not merit government action. And that's why it is important to relate the space for public debate to the way the country is run and to the political, the control of the economy. Just to give one idea, and because those cases were not taken by the president, in 2009 there was still some vibrant press. There was an uproar in the media about these cases. And in 2010, and just now also, the government decided to tighten the net on civil society because there have been spaces where people are still able to discuss and criticize what is happening in the country. And the government just submitted, or the executive submitted, a bill to the National Assembly to deal with cybercrime. And I will just run through 4 of the articles to have an idea what do the authorities want to do with the use of the internet in the country. Article 17, for instance, prohibits the online posting or sharing of photos, recordings, or videos without the consent of those in the contents, meaning that if this conference is not labeled as public, for any posting of a picture of this conference, each one of you in the room has to authorize for it to be posted. And this is just a way basically to make social media, Facebook and blogging virtually criminal activities for those who do not toe the line, because the state media and government as institutions are exempted from this law. And the punishment is 2 to 8 years in prison for those who break the law. And I just learned yesterday that the government is considering it a harsh measure and is happy to lower it to a 1-year maximum term in prison. Article 18 prohibits the sending or forwarding of messages with the intent, among others, to disturb the peace and tranquility or the personal, familiar, or sexual life of another person, whatever that means, and it carries a sentence of 2 to 8 years in prison. And the government also is thinking now that the sentence is harsh and is willing to reduce it to half. And then we have Article 24 to deal with the bin Ladens of Angola and what the government perceives to be the Angolan terrorists. So It encompasses what the government calls intent of changing or subverting the functioning of state institutions or forcing the authorities to undertake certain actions. If someone calls for a demonstration on the internet and the police charges against this demonstration, the culprits are not the police officers that charge against the demonstration, but those who call for the demonstration can be sued as terrorists for forcing the police to take brutal action. And that carries a maximum sentence of 16 years in prison. Then the Article 75 is basically brilliant. Any soldier, police officer, or state security officer can search any home without warrant to apprehend data equipment such as computers, hard drives, anything that transmits data, if there is any suspicion that the individual is engaged in some form of criminal activities on the internet. One critical point about this law is that the first draft started to circulate in 2007. And it was posted online by the Ministry of Telecommunications. None of those articles I have mentioned were part of this law, draft law. And when the Ministry of Telecommunications submitted it to the presidency, that's where those articles were included. Because now the presidency also submits all the legislation to Parliament for approval. And it has the legislative initiative in the country. And these additions were a response to the popular uprisings in North Africa, because people were speaking in Angola a lot about those uprisings and taking lessons and inspiration from it. And the social media in those countries became a contributing factor in mobilizing people for the uprising. But to explain why the government is so concerned with the net, I have to give you just an overview of what has been the pattern in dealing with the media that does not fall in line with the system. In '94, there was the media, independent media was just emerging. And there was a newsletter that circulated by fax to a few hundred subscribers. And it was so critical in exposing abuse of power, corruption, and what also was happening with the military, that it became viral, even though it was only distributed to a few hundred subscribers. Everyone somehow managed to make copies of it and distribute around. And because of those exposures, the director and the leading journalist, Ricardo Melo, was shot and killed in January '95. And that was thought to be the end of any other attempts at independent media in the country. In '96, out of desperation, a German Catholic priest, Father Conrad, went out the city distributing pamphlets calling for a demonstration because of the awful conditions in which people were living, and to call for support for freedom of expression. He was arrested and thrown in jail, but that did not deter people from keep on trying and expressing their concerns. And in 2010, two independent newspapers who had gained credibility and a reputation in addressing some issues, particularly on corruption and abuse of power, were taken over by state security proxy companies. So to this day, the directors of these newspapers don't know whom they dealt with or they deal with. And these papers, before they go to print, they have to be sent to censorship. So the country has gone back to a period where, and the censors will go point by point before the paper is sent to print. And one day, to give an example, Semanário Angolense, decided to dodge the censors and sent the paper directly to the printing press. And the censors didn't feel concerned. They went to the printing press, took the papers, and burned them. So, case solved. And why is the internet a target? The president explains it in his own words. He made a speech on April 15, 2011, complaining that rumors have been circulating on the internet that he has a $20 billion fortune. And no one has, those whom I have spoken to, and many people keep asking, where did that number $20 billion come from? Because no one has seen a pamphlet circulating with that number. And then the president says that in the so-called social media, there has been talk of a revolution, but no conversation on democratic changes through the ballot. This is the way of provocation. People are choosing to overthrow elected governments that are duly abiding by their mandates. And as I've explained before, the executive has a mandate, but the president as such does not have a mandate. And that's why popular mandate. And that's why to this day, he's not been able to be sworn in. So we have a president that has not been sworn in because even though the Constitution has changed, the Constitution does not makes him only a caretaker until the next elections take place. And only 3% of Angolans have access to the internet of the 18 million people. So why is it critical? Again, because it's because the regime is not used to engage in dialogue with its own people. So any crack in that system, the system basically operates on the basis of see no evil, hear no evil, talk no evil. And when that doesn't happen, then it becomes problematic because people start complaining. And also Angolans have a tradition of disseminating information by word of mouth. And if there is an anti-regime sentiment, then as the news travel along, people keep adding their own narrative to the news, which might be troublesome. And now with this new law that has already been approved by the National Assembly, it's just going to the final stages for the final approval, probably next week. The government would have a legal basis to manipulate and silence public opinion in a way of striking fear to people that if they use their computers to disseminate information the government doesn't like, they will have their goods confiscated. Then there is the part on the political economy, how it is tied to information. Because people want to participate. Angola is endowed with vast mineral resources, and people want to participate in the economic process. People want to have benefits from the riches of their own country. And the government for years has been praising itself for being at the helm of one of the fastest growing economies in the world, with a real GDP growth of 14% from 2005 to 2009. And that is mostly due to the oil prices, because over 80% of Angolan revenues come from oil. And in 2010, also there is a new class of wealthy people in Angola. And in 2010, Angolan private investment surpassed foreign investment in the country outside the oil and diamond sector, accounting for more than 50% of the total $4 billion. And with any space for debate, the question remains, who are these rich Angolans? Where did they get their money from? And then we have the reality of the paradoxes, the extreme levels of poverty, and the centrality of the informal economic activities. Over 30%, only up to 30% of the Angolan urban population have formal jobs. Most people survive through the informal sector. And the financial system as it is designed, as the brain of the economy, excludes small and medium enterprises. And how does it exclude small and medium enterprises? And before that, just to give you an idea as well of this concentration of powers, this is taken from the website of the Ministry of Finances, the 2011 budget, state budget. The president's executive takes up 86.28% of the budget, and the 18 provinces of Angola are left with the rest. So basically, some of these provinces are in a situation of mendacity. They have to beg the authorities. And if one takes what governors walk home with, there is very little in terms of provision of services to the people beyond the capital. So on April 19, the National Assembly passed the bill. Under those conditions and lack of infrastructure and a banking system also that is controlled by public officials, and I'm talking about the private sector, the National Assembly passed a bill that sets 1 million as the minimum amount of money needed to qualify for as private investment and merit state incentives. And this law discourages small businesses because the government's argument is that small and medium enterprises can benefit from the Angolan Development Bank, which was established in 2010 to help boost the Angolan economy. And this bank manages 5% of the oil proceeds and 5% of the diamond proceeds. The problem is that the individuals who most benefit from the loans given by this bank are the very same public officials that already control the private sector. So that this bank for development has become a sort of an ATM machine for the ruling elite. And if there is, because small and medium enterprises are unable to flourish outside the realm of the state, it makes it difficult for individuals, organizations, and groups to have alternative sources of funding beyond the state or international donors. And what is the private sector? And why is this law so important? Because, again, the very same high-ranking public officials and their family members who control the formal private sector through all sorts of business enterprises will be the beneficiaries of this law and will have the state incentives to do whatever they want. And that also is tied to foreign investment because foreign companies to invest in Angola must, if they want to succeed in the market, establish joint ventures with public officials. And when companies do their due diligence, they look for those who have real power and can be as close as possible to the president to guarantee them the protection of that impunity of these officials can afford them. And And I've just mentioned that basically the government officials are also in the private sector. And this duality of roles is not allowed by Angolan laws. And in 2010, as a follow-up to the president's stand on the fight against corruption, a new law was passed to compile all the existing legislation on corruption. And it prohibits public officials from receiving gifts. And it's very harsh. Even a $1 bill is considered a gift and it can be illegal. And it prohibits public officials from engaging in the various joint ventures I was talking about, and also forbids public officials from having private jobs while that might pose a conflict of interest with their duties. So, and prior to this law, there was the law on the crimes committed by public office bearers that also clearly set a line between public interest and private, public duty and private interest, and that public officials were not allowed to engage in business activities involving the state for personal benefit. And we also have the Angolan Penal Code that defines in very clear terms what is passive and active corruption. And furthermore, the Angolan government has signed to all the relevant treaties, international treaties on corruption, the UN Convention, the African Union Convention, and the Southern African Development Community Protocol against corruption. And I'll just give you a few examples on that, how corruption is addressed in the country from a legal point of view, and how the legal system is used not to enforce the law, but to exclude and to punish those who either fall out of line or then those who are irrelevant to the system. In 2010, the Attorney General publicly stated that $160 million had been looted from the central bank, and he called it the work of masters. But days later, the Attorney General released a list of the masters who committed that crime. And they're cleaners, drivers, archivists, porters, and it's hard to believe that cleaners in Angola have sophistication to wire transfer such huge amounts of money. And the president did not hold the governor of the central bank accountable for what happened at the bank, promoted him to Minister of Economy. And that has been the pattern of the president's authority and how he's been using his powers to deal with corruption by promoting those who outstand in doing it. And another example that was discussed here in the US in a Senate investigation has to do with the transfer of $100 million from the central bank in 2002 by the then governor of the bank, Mr. Ginaldo Jaime. In November 2002, the US reversed the transactions and informed the Angolan government of the operation. But a month later, the president promoted Mr. Jaime to deputy prime minister. And as of November now, he heads the private agency for investment. So if any American official wants to talk about investment, must go and talk to him. Another example of the conflation between public and the private roles. You go to the website of the central bank. The laws are very clear in the separation of powers. And then you'll find a number of public officials on the boards of the banks in which they're shareholders. We have the Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly, Chairman of the board of Banco Sol, a private bank. But the president cannot do anything about it because his wife is a shareholder, qualified shareholder of that bank, and she has also been acting in executive positions, as documents in public records have demonstrated. And there is also General Kundipayama, who at the time when he was Minister of Defense in 2008, he set up his own bank and has been chairman of the board of his own bank. And that is against the Angolan laws. So all these issues with a very small independent press can be, the government and the president essentially can be taken to task. And the reason why is because of the concentration of powers in his office. He must be accountable for all these acts because he has the sole decision power to decide on whether to prosecute corruption or not. And one very brief look at the oil sector as the main lever of Angola's economy. By law, Sonangol is the exclusive concession holder of oil and gas in Angola. And this is also how this regime has become extremely powerful because in dealing with the international community, countries with oil interest in Angola have to lobby these very same regime for the expansion of their businesses in the country. And what also, due to the pressure the government had to become more transparent and accountable, as the IMF and some other international institutions demanded, Angolan government officials decided to do something more transparent, capture shares in the oil blocks instead of just taking the proceeds from it, become shareholders of the oil blocks. And they do it in joint ventures with foreign multinationals. US foreign multinationals, Total, and others. And so in that sense, foreign multinationals have become the most powerful accessories in aiding and abetting top-level corruption in the country. Because to protect their interests, they have to protect corruption in the country. And also the protection given by their own countries of origins have to be extended to these officials to protect the national business interests. And one example is with Cobalt International Energy, a US company. In 2010, it received 2 oil blocks without bidding. And by norm, oil blocks in Angola are awarded through open biddings. And this company was just very lucky to get 2 oil blocks and 40% shares in each 2 deeper water oil blocks, and had to form a consortium with 2 private phony Angolan oil companies, Nazaki Oil and Gas, which got 30%, and Alper Oil, which received 10%. And because these are phony companies, they didn't have the money to pay upfront for their participation. Cobalt paid for them. And this is the structure of one of the companies, just to give you a very brief idea. The chairman and CEO of the national oil company, Sonangol, is one of the owners of Cobalt with 33% of the shares. The Minister of State and head of the national security, the most trusted President General, is another shareholder with equal shares. And Copelipa's Lieutenant General Leopoldino Nascimento is also another shareholder. And they control this group, this phony holding company, Grupo A4, which in turn owns 99.96% of Nazaki. That only does not violate Angolan laws, but also might be in breach of US laws. And just to finish, in my view, these legal initiatives are part of a strategy to return the country to a fully fledged totalitarian regime. And that is crucial because with all these exposures, in 2010, the Constitution passed a blanket amnesty for war crimes and all violent crimes committed during the war period. But there is no amnesty for economic crimes. And public officials can still be prosecuted for those crimes even after they leave office. And one of the positive notes of the new constitution, which did not have in the previous constitution, is now that the president can also be unseated for corruption cases. And that's why it's important to prevent that corruption becomes an issue. And for democracy to take root in the country, I say in very polite terms that Angolans must strive for the devolution of the state, because the state has been captured by these individuals, and it must be returned to the people. And what are the lessons from Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, which have been causing headaches in Angola? It's the ability to harness people's power, to bring people together, to form solidarity for a common cause, and the use of social networks to help in that mobilization. And there are also the pitfalls, the lessons that Angolans must learn. The divisiveness, the lack of leadership, the lack of post-authoritarian common agenda and strategy, and also violent confrontation as it happens in Libya, which no Angolan wants to see repeated in the country after 27 years of civil war. But that should not deter Angolans from wanting to participate in the process and to clean up the acts of their own government. And two simple recommendations for US foreign companies and governments, or foreign companies. One is that companies must avoid what they have been doing so far, which is to look for politically exposed persons to set up joint ventures with. So they have to perform strict due diligence before making business deals in Angola and comply with Angolan and international anti-corruption and money laundering laws. And foreign countries like the US also should make anti-corruption and freedom of expression central to their foreign policy towards Angola, because this is what will help in the end promote greater and diversified investments beyond the oil and diamond sector, and also help Angolans to have access to information to make informed decisions, so that there is no desperation for other acts rather than those that we have established as part of the democratic process, dialogue, debate, and so forth, to change the country. And I end here. Thank you.